Hi everyone. In this class we're going to be talking a little bit about a phenomenon known as suburban sprawl and the idea of how sprawl can be corrected, repaired, retrofitted to produce more sustainable outcomes than we would typically expect from that kind of pattern. The first point I want to make about this is just that suburbanization has been going on in the United States for a long time. It's easy to think of this as a 20th century phenomenon and even as a phenomenon that dates to the post-war period in the United States after the Second World War. But in fact, there's a number of phases of suburbanization. So when we're talking about sprawl, we're really talking about the most recent period of suburbanization. And it has specific features that differentiate it from previous forms of suburbanization. So it becomes less sustainable over time. And that is something that I'm going to try to highlight in this presentation. So if you think about the sort of classic era of American suburbs, which many of us associate with the 1950s and a sort of leave it to beaver or father's knows best type of ethos in the United States. This is the time when the GIs are returning from the Second World War and taking advantage of a variety of incentives, including low interest rate and low or no down payment mortgages to secure a single family home, even if they might be working class or lower middle class. So while previous suburbs were more reserved for elites, this is really sort of when the suburb becomes a feature of it's associated with a very large, abundant, and prosperous middle class. So when we're talking about suburbs like Levittown, and we're looking here at an aerial view of the Levittown on Long Island, this would not be considered sprawl. And the reason is that it is not that far away from the city. Even though this pattern relies on the use of the car and the single family home, neither of which are incredibly sustainable, because not that much suburbanization has happened, Levittown is not incredibly far distant from New York City. So when you're thinking about the kind of suburbanization that takes place in the post-war decades, the kind that Tim Burton is satirizing, for example, in Edward Scissorhands, we're really not talking about sprawl. Sprawl is a more recent phenomenon, and it has to do with the fact that as suburbanization continues, the green land on which these suburbs is being built is farther and farther out. So there is a kind of reclaiming of land that was agricultural land and turning that into suburbs. Okay, so of course you know that the Levitts built their empire, for example, in Long Island out of potato farms that they bought from farmers. So that was previously agricultural land, but this is agricultural land that's farther and farther out. So you can't really tell from looking at a slide like this one, or this one, or even this one, which depicts a golf course development. You can't really say for certain that these are sprawl, although you probably have an inkling that that's true. And the reason is you can tell that these are more recent construction. So by definition, they're farther and farther away from the cities for which they're serving as bedroom communities. So there are some sort of ways that you can tell. So for example, if you look at this slide and you look at, for example, some of the single family homes in this development, you'll notice, so here's a single family home with two car garages. Things like that are sort of an indicator, right, that there is that this is a sprawl neighborhood because a massive amount of storage is needed for the car. If you look at these, you can see that there are huge garages on the front of what's also a very huge property. And in general, you can see that the houses are growing larger and larger, almost to fill the lots that are allotted. So these are ways that you could tell that you might be looking at sprawl, but the only way you can really tell for certain is to understand what's around, right? So these are examples of sprawl suburban developments because you can see that they're actually on agricultural edges. These are out far enough that there are wall-to-wall suburbs behind them as you move toward the city. And these are sort of like the leading edge now that are pushing farther and farther out into rural agricultural areas. So the only way to really define sprawl for sure is to see what's around. When green space is around a neighborhood, you know that that's a sprawl neighborhood. And just to hit you with another urban planning definition here, the opposite of sprawl is infill development. So rather than going out to a green rural edge, you find a space that is either going to be redeveloped or hasn't been developed already, right? And you put something there that you need that's in closer. So infill is sort of the opposite concept and is often preferred by people who are interested in sustainable design because they don't want to contribute to these huge commutes, right? So really the problem with sprawl, I mean, there are many problems. Let's go through them somewhat in order. And I just want to say that there is a relationship here between the reliance on petrochemical agriculture. So one of the reasons why, and you can see here that even though the number of acres in the United States that are under cultivation for agriculture are decreasing steadily from the 1950s to the 1990s, even though the acreage is decreasing, the yields are going up. And the yields are going up because of what is sort of incorrectly named the green revolution, right? Which is the reliance on oil-based fertilizers to replenish the inputs that are taken out of the soil every year with the harvesting of the crops, and also the heavy reliance on pesticides to support massive monocultures that spread across the acreage that is under production. So that's its own environmentally significant problem. But this is one of the reasons why suburbs have been able to sprawl for such distance, is that it is not necessary to have so many acres under cultivation with these incredibly high yields that come out of the sort of agricultural industrial complex. Okay, so what's wrong with sprawl? There are, I'm going to discuss 4 things. The first is negative environmental impacts. You're taking land that is green in some way, you clear it of trees and vegetation because it's much easier to develop land that it has nothing on it, right? So whatever is growing there, whatever is alive there is taken out, okay? So you can see that that has a negative impact right away. What's replaced is a lot, for example, of non-living things. So nothing that, for example, is absorbing carbon as trees and vegetation would. And also, it's a lot of impervious surface, roofs, driveways, right? So then there becomes a stormwater issue as well. But one of the biggest things is that to get there and to get back is going to require large amounts of fossil fuel in your car. So sprawl would become more sustainable if you were driving an electric car and if that electric car was being charged off of 100% renewables. That would help mitigate some of the impacts of sprawl. Okay, so this is a diagram. I actually think you should go back and look at Terra Nova and look at Eric Sanderson's diagrams, because this one is actually just very specific to New England. It's trying to show the trends in New England and by each New England state versus the United States as a whole. But regardless of what segment you're looking at here in this chart, one of the things that you can see is growing by the largest percentage is vehicle mileage. And that has to do with land being developed farther and farther from city centers, more than it has to do with population growth, right? So if you look, for example, at a state like Connecticut on this chart, you can see that even though population growth has, grown very little, even though population growth has not grown much, the amount of developed land and the amount of vehicle mileage has, right? And that's characteristic of a sprawl problem. It isn't that we have so many more people in a given region, it's that they live farther away from where they need to work and where they need to shop, and that creates a huge increase in vehicle mileage. So that VMT statistic, vehicle miles traveled, that Sanderson is talking about in the reading, he's tracking that same statistic. Okay, so you have the environmental impacts of sprawl, and we could probably enumerate further ones that make sprawl a problem. I also want to just point out that sprawl has a kind of perverse economics attending to it, which has to do with the fact that you can achieve lower tax revenues per every acre of sprawl. Whatever municipality that sprawl is in gets much lower revenues per acre from the sprawl pattern. At the same time, it will cost that municipality much more to provide services to those locations. So let's just talk very briefly about how that works. So this is sort of a summary of looking at county property taxes across a range of different cities. So it's sort of an aggregate. And what this is trying to show is that it is very hard to have a tax base that is purely residential. The best thing for a tax base is mixed use, where you have commercial properties operating in the same footprint as residential properties. And that is somewhat stacked. So if you look at this, you can see that county square footage, and so if your county is usually like farther out, you can get about $1 of tax if with pure residential development. If you're in the city and you're purely residential, you get almost 4 times that much. It's still a pretty low number. If you have a big box store or a strip mall, you can get more from your acreage that is on. But where you really start to pull some tax money is when you're in mixed use, high rise development. And if you think about this, of course, this makes sense, because what this graphic is showing you is tax revenue on a per acre basis, right? So if you have more people living on the same acre, higher density, high-rise development, you are going to have a lot more tax dollars to work with. Okay, so from the point of view of revenue, you'd much rather be looking at dense, multi-story development rather than just, for example, a single family home on a large property. Okay, if you look at this, and I'm sorry this is so blurry, I really love this illustration. This actually helps you to see why, if your development is lower density, low rise, sprawled out, and what this is actually it's hard to see it, but this is actually a photograph of a strip mall. And it's been overlaid with sort of like a chalk drawing of what if it were denser and high rise, right? All of those kind of ghost units there that aren't there, right? Were they there, they would all be putting tax revenue on this acreage, right? And so the economics would shift from a large amount of area with very low tax base to the same amount of area with many more people paying into your municipal kitty, right? So this helps us to actually see why high density development is much more valuable for municipalities than a kind of a sprawl model development. There's also the fact that in sprawl, it actually, because the distances are long, if you think about, for example, creating a road is going to cost you the same amount per linear foot no matter where you are, right? So if you are connecting, fewer properties are paying for that road, then you have a situation where it costs you the same to build the road, but you have fewer people contributing, not only to its initial construction, but to its maintenance. And the same is going to go for running any utility, right? So if you're going to try to run town water to this facility, if you're going to run electric streetlights, if you're going to create sidewalks for this area, if you're going to run sewer line, right? So if any of those amenities that we assume will be part of suburban life actually become almost prohibitively expensive in these very distant regions. So it is probably more likely, for example, that you will not have those amenities. You will have, for example, each property will have to maintain its own septic system because there won't be town sewer. There may not be municipal trash collection or, things like that, road plowing, because there isn't a tax base to support that. And this graphic is actually based on Canadian research. So it doesn't reflect US values, but it gives you a sort of way of visualizing the more households you have, right? In their urban setting, they're sort of showing like a townhouse, right? But they're not really making clear that this is smaller, right, per acre, because you're taking up less space. You're crammed in less space in the city. But as a result, your taxes are actually lower, right? So for example, paying for storm and wastewater in the urban setting might cost you $147. That's what it would cost the city for your household's share. But the same thing spread over much fewer occupants and a larger area is going to cost $613 in the suburban setting. So the same amenities are being provided, but they cost much, much more when you have a more spread out development. So from a tax perspective, this helps to explain why there are advantages to being in an urban setting. Even if your tax rate is much higher in an urban setting, you could be paying a lot less in tax. Okay, and then the next thing I want to talk about is the public health issue with sprawl. There you can see I'm citing an old U.S. News story on this. There has been much more research done on this since 2012. But essentially, the takeaway from this is that long commutes have a very negative impact on both physical and mental health for American adults. So there's actually a real sense in which there is a sort of suburban public health crisis associated with these very long commutes. And you can see that the negative health impacts actually they add on the more mileage you have to commute on a daily basis. So the whole notion that has sort of been promoted by the U.S. real estate industry of drive till you qualify, right? So that you can get this wonderful 5,000 square foot house with 4-car garage. You just have to drive a long way to get it. Really, has a sort of health impact that is quite significant. There's kind of an irony that driving has always been associated with American freedom, mobility. You can do what you want, go where you want, when you want to. And that in a culture of congestion, what that means is you sort of have the freedom to sit in traffic. And certainly, I hope you've been following along with the stories right now having to do with the reduction, for example, in air pollution as coronavirus has kept everybody at home. Okay, so the last point on this list, I have some problems with because I do find sprawl ugly, but I think a lot of times sprawl has been attacked on grounds that it's not attractive. And I don't think that's actually, that ends up becoming kind of a subjective perception where people can then start defending what sprawl looks like, saying it's not that bad or touting its advantages. And I think that ends up taking energy away from the very real negative impacts that have to do with environment, have to do with how much we're spending to have a home, and that have to do with the health impacts of this kind of pattern. I think those are all reasons that are of a fundamentally different order, and shouldn't in a sense occupy the same list as aesthetic considerations. That said, I want to end here with a project that is an example of sprawl retrofit. So in the reading, Emily Tallon, who's a leading scholar of this sort of movement of sprawl repair, sprawl retrofit, she teaches at Arizona State, which, has a lot of these issues with sprawl. It's much more recent construction. and a lot of it has happened in a sprawl pattern. Phoenix is a city it's often lumped in with like Atlanta or Houston, these kind of Sunbelt cities that have gotten very, very spread out and don't really have traditional city centers. So what can we do about these places? And one of the ideas that has come up is to take these existing buildings, and you can see this one very much, we don't know what this was before, but it very much, this is in Denton, Texas, by the way. It looks, a lot like something like this, like a strip mall type architecture. It has a large paved parking lot in the front. And to reuse these and to kind of transform them into something that has more sense of place, that has more architectural quality, and that enhances community rather than destroying it. So I'm going to show you this project. I like this project a lot, but I'm also going to criticize this project. So the exciting part of this project is this is that same building. So there's a pretty dramatic transformation here from something that sort of lacks architectural quality. It is a large rectangular box with a kind of false front on it, which you can see it's very typical of this kind of big box store or strip mall. And what the architects have done is essentially remove that false front and create this sort of glass wall. They've added some nice low maintenance, xeriscaping, meaning landscaping that doesn't require a lot of water, which is a good thing in Texas. And they've done something, that I think is actually a really fun, low-cost thing on the front here, is they've sort of played with transparency by alternating panels of frosted glass with different levels of translucency. And then they have these little sort of transparent peekaboo spots, which I imagine are really kind of fun for kids to play with. It looks like that's the kids' room there in the front of the library. So they've added they've added a lot of quality to a structure that really didn't particularly have much. However, if you look at it from this angle, you can see that part of why they have taken this photograph of the building is that there's really just a tiny little strip of green space here. What you still have is a giant parking lot. This is all impervious surface. It's creating a stormwater problem. It's removing the water from this property rather than allowing it to settle in and be stored in the ground. And it doesn't really add green space. It actually still has a pretty giant parking lot. So it's a lot better. I don't know that it's, the most fantastic thing I've ever seen, but I think it's a lot better than what it was previously. And I think it also sort of creates a sense of what could be done with these kinds of properties. However, there's still the issue that a lot of these properties, really most of them, are built in the cheapest possible way in an era of peak oil with no thought of any kind of insulation or how to keep the conditioned air inside this space. So by reusing this space, we get the benefit of not incurring more embodied energy, right? Because we're really only superficially rebuilding a building like this when we retrofit. And the problem is we're really inheriting the sort of poor quality construction from the previous generation. So I think this is a really interesting idea. I still question how much we really should be retrofitting big box stores and strip malls, and how much we should be actually just removing these and perhaps starting over. So that's a question that I'm left with this, because certainly the greenest building, as they say, is the one that already exists. So in that sense, this is a great project. However, it's going to cost the city of Denton, Texas, an enormous amount to cool this building in the hot Texas sun. And I'm not sure how well that has been addressed by this retrofit project. So this is an example with some pros and cons for you to think about. I would also, if you haven't already, urge you to read the Emily Talon piece, where she sort of has this, I think, a very thoughtful strategy, and particularly about, she is looking at surface parking lots. And that's another important topic, is how to reduce or eliminate surface parking in these large sprawl environments, which takes up an enormous amount of space, and takes space that could be green space and paves it under a bunch of asphalt, which has a number of kind of compounding environmental problems. So that's specifically what she is looking at in that article. Okay, thanks everybody.